UK exploratory study. Thank you, Qamar.
Right. Hi. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining today. Today I'll just be going through some of the research we're doing at the University of Reading on managing heat exposure on construction sites. So just a quick overview of today's presentation. We're looking at why we've chosen heat and the UK, two things that are not usually synonymous, why construction workers have been identified as a vulnerable population, a little bit about how the research was carried out, and then some emerging themes that we have so far. So just to give you a sort of background on why the UK. So recent temperature changes in the UK have shown a clear change from norms that we've previously experienced. We've had severe heat episodes, which in 2022 recorded the highest temperature in the UK right here in Cambridge. And while these used to be sort of one-off events, climate attribution studies show that they're becoming increasingly the norms at a very quick rate. So the summer that we've seen this year, with the hottest May and Junes on record, happened 12 years sooner than previous predictions had anticipated. And then within the regulatory framework, there isn't much to guide climate adaptation on construction sites. So there isn't a maximum working temperature, and then the guidance comes from the Health and Safety Executive, is found to be quite generic and not very applicable to the realities of a construction site. So why construction workers as a vulnerable population? So the ILO identified construction workers as particularly vulnerable because of a combination of factors. So they're carrying out manually intensive work. They're constantly exposed to climatic conditions. And then also they are wearing PPE, which provides a barrier to thermal evaporation, which inhibits thermoregulatory function. But then also, if you look at it from the macro societal level, heat in the UK is usually seen as a positive thing. So it's not perceived as a risk. It's seen as something that we should take advantage of. And that has led to excess morbidity and mortality during heatwave events. When you look at the safety culture in construction, there's a tendency to take advantage of heat and summer events because you're trying to compensate for the loss of time that would have happened during the winter due to things that are baked into the contract. So in the winter, we do have provisions to stop for high winds, lightning, etc. So you want to make up for that when the summer comes. And then when you look at the micro personal level, you have migrant workers coming in the summer to take advantage of these seasonal work patterns. But it's also dominated by a primarily masculine culture where people try to sort of work through the difficulties that they might be facing rather than acknowledging that they could use some further support. So what is the gap exactly? We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We do know that the most basic and cheap heat adaptation measures are the most effective. So hydration, taking breaks, sitting in the shade, these work quite well. And they're not very difficult to implement. But what happens is a lot of the studies that take place happen within sort of lab environments and heat chambers, but a live site, they are not. So they don't reflect the logistical challenges of managing heat, and they also don't reflect the complex nature of the people who are actually taking out the construction work themselves. So to answer this question, we visited multiple construction sites. Selected for this study, we tried to focus on a variety of logistical factors. So we chose a high-rise residential building So obviously vertical circulation being the main issue. We also looked at a hydroelectric water project, which was categorized by the fact that it was mobile dispersed working. And then finally, the installation of overhead power transmission lines, which presented its very own unique logistical challenges. So we tried to get a large image of some of the key logistical issues that are happening today. To do that, we took out 43 semi-structured interviews with operatives and managers. So 33 of those respondents were operatives and 10 of them were managers, which is quite a change from what you usually have. So people don't, a lot of the current studies don't tend to speak to the operatives themselves. They tend to focus on the managers. But what we found was that there were some really interesting opinions that we could get from the operatives themselves. So the research was carried out in the southeast of England, which was identified as a high-risk area for occupational heat exposure in the latest climate change risk assessment. And you can see on the map there, it just shows the temperature anomalies over summer 2025. So the areas that we were concentrated in might not be particularly dispersed, but they represent a pretty wide area of the UK where we saw 1.5 degrees of temperature anomaly. Okay, so some of the emerging themes that came out of this. From the interviews, we found that there were 43 respondents, 42 of them identified logistical issues, followed by organizational, behavioral, and attitudinal issues. So for the scope of this paper, we just looked at the logistical issues being the primary one. And you can see a kind of theme here in terms of the issues that were identified, so pace of work, access to water, etc. They kind of sit at the intersection between behavior and organization. And if you look at these sort of vignettes that we took out of each of the logistical issues identified, you can see that there's a really strong relationship between pace of work and access to water. So from a regulatory perspective, in the UK, you have to provide drinking water at all work sites anyway. But the problem is that people weren't able to access them as frequently as they need to do to stay hydrated. And the issue was because of the pace of work, they felt like they couldn't take the time to either walk to the water station, or they worried about the time that it would take them to go to the welfare facility a few hours after hydrating. And then PPE and shaded rest areas came out again at the intersection between behavior and organization, because the same PPE was being used in the summer as was being used in the winter. So this was a big issue for the infrastructure projects because they have to wear fireproof overalls. And it led to some unsafe workarounds where people were sort of cutting off sleeves, rolling up trousers, and that kind of thing. An avoidable issue really, because there are summer overalls that you can get with a similar arc rating. So again, it's about planning ahead for the construction project. Equipment and machinery was found to be a particularly acute problem. So for one of the sites that we had, which was the overhead power installation, we had aluminium trackway all along the grid. And on the aluminium trackway, we recorded temperature of 55 degrees when the ambient air temperature was 27. So, so what it shows us is that operatives do know what they need to do in the heat, but the problem is that the organizational structure sometimes prevents them from being able to take those actions. So who does this benefit in terms of why do we need to know this? In terms of academia, as far as we know, this is sort of one of the first on-the-ground investigations within the UK context. So we're looking at the contractual regulatory conditions that these construction sites operate in. In terms of the industry, we're providing grounded recommendations within the realities of a construction site. So we haven't done this in a lab that's removed from the complexities of sort of human behavior and interaction. And then finally, for policy, it provides evidence-based recommendations that could be used for the development of guidelines that could help enforce some of these ideas of adaptation, which, as you said, are quite simple and quite cheap when you look at them. So just in summary, climate change, one of the defining public health features of our time. There are limited opportunities for acclimatization currently. So when you look at other countries which have these sort of specific measures in place, it's quite simple for them to take a day off when the temperature hits 40 degrees. But in the UK, it's a very expensive and contractually burdensome process. But what we're saying is, don't just stop work. We can continue to work, but in a safer way, if we look at planning, procurement, scheduling, welfare provision, while acknowledging the realities of the new climate that we live in today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for an excellent presentation on a very interesting and important topic. Any questions?